Cannibalism is the most monstrous act of the monstrous acts, and, after centuries of living with the butchering hand of the male gaze, women have begun to reclaim an appetite for flesh. You can only be on a diet for so long, after all, before you get really, really hungry. Chelsea G. Summers. Is there anything more taboo than cannibalism? You'd be hard-pressed to think of something that is. And yet, cannibalism as a metaphor has taken the internet by storm in the past couple of years. It's hardly a new concept, of course, with the earliest documented example of its use tracing back to the 12th century. Cannibalism as an act has existed since the dawn of time. Religious cannibalism, ritualistic cannibalism, necessary cannibalism. But symbolic cannibalism, the kind that's widely referred to today as cannibalism as a metaphor for love, didn't come about until the 12th century in France. Lie d'Honneur was the name of the French story originating from medieval times, and it was a story about 12 women all being courted by the same man, Ignare. When they find out, they are, of course, furious and demand that he choose one of them to henceforth be loyal to, or they will tell their husbands what he has been doing. Ignare refuses these terms, so the women do good on their promise and tell their husbands, who are enraged by their wives' unfaithfulness. The husbands then kill Ignare and feed his heart and his penis to the women. The women, upon finding out what they have just ingested, promise to never eat again and end up all dying of starvation. The act of feeding the women his heart and penis, the organs most representative of the women's fascination with their lover, is meant as a punishment for the lady's transgressions, but in its secrecy becomes a bizarre manifestation of transgressive behavior in itself. This action is a perversion of the Last Supper and, by association, of the Eucharist. Here, eating the body only creates greater loss, and all sense of redemption is negated, according to Brown University. Now, this story of unintentional or unknown cannibalism is not exactly the metaphor we're most used to seeing. Instead of the act of eating one's lover being affectionate and almost erotic, the women in the story are horrified to learn that they have unintentionally done. But while Lie d'Honneur is a good place to start on the metaphorical cannibalism side of things, it is not nearly the best nor earliest example of human-on-human ingestion in the media. Ignoring vampires, for now, the next most popular example of cannibalism in the media was Goya's painting of Saturn devouring his son. The Black Paintings are a series of 14 paintings done by Francisco Goya between 1918 and 1923. They were never actually meant to see the light of day, as he painted them directly on the walls of his house. The Black Paintings are widely regarded as disturbing and stomach-churning and whatnot, but I personally believe those words are a bit exaggerated for the subject matter. Regardless, the painting he did of Saturn devouring his son is a depiction of cannibalism out of compulsive fear. As the story goes, the Roman god Saturn feared that his children would overthrow him so much that, to keep himself as the one in power, he ate them. People will often speak about how Saturn is just evil for what he did, but personally, I think there is much more complexity and nuance to the emotions of the storytelling than that. If it were so straightforward, Goya would likely not have included it in his Black Paintings. Just like any painting or piece of art, it is highly subjective and up to interpretation. But my personal interpretation is that Saturn did not want to do what he was doing. In the painting, he looks terrified both of himself and of his actions. As I previously stated, Saturn's actions were born out of a compulsive fear of being overthrown. He felt he had to do something, and it horrified himself the whole time he was eating his sons. I mean, just look at his eyes. Goya's depiction of Saturn does not lend itself to the utter devotion and affection that I seek to understand in this essay, though, so I fear I have exhausted my points on this painting. I love it, though, and I actually did my own oil rendition of it. In 1846, Thomas Prest wrote a short story romance by the name of A String of Pearls. This short story was later, in 1970, adapted by Christopher Bond into a play named Sweeney Todd. Of course, Sondheim later turned it into a musical, and it is now one of the most popular musicals of all time. Sweeney Todd is an interesting blend of whimsy and macabre, combining the bloodthirsty, cannibalistic themes with lighthearted and fun music. For those unfamiliar, here is a brief summary of Sweeney Todd. Spoilers ahead, of course. According to IMDb, Sweeney Todd is about an evil Judge Turpin who lusts for the beautiful wife of a London barber and transports him to Australia for a crime he did not commit. Returning after 15 years and now calling himself Sweeney Todd, the now madman vows revenge, applying his razor to unlucky customers and shuttling the bodies down to Mrs. Lovett, who uses them in her meat pie shop. Though many fall to his blade, he will not be satisfied until he slits Turpin's throat. Sweeney Todd's murder and ultimately cannibalism is born out of devotion to his daughter and to his wife. Sweeney Todd is where we start to see cannibalism being used to hammer home themes of near reverent worship. While Sweeney Todd never actually does any ingesting of the person he loves, it is nonetheless closer to where we will find ourselves at the end of this essay. He does what he thinks he must in order to avenge those that he loves, a romantic theme that finds itself winding through many of the popular cannibalistic stories. Hannibal is a prequel spin-off show to Silence of the Lambs. Admittedly, I never actually finished the third season of the show, and there is far too much content packed into its 3 seasons for me to provide a full summary. So let's talk about themes and premise. The main character of the show, Will Graham, is a criminal profiler who is spectacularly good at his job because of how well he is able to put himself in the shoes of his killers. He is working on a case at the start of the show that is particularly challenging, and his psychiatrist, Hannibal Lecter, helps Will find and catch killers. They're a brilliant pair, and their work together is highly effective. However, obvious spoiler here, Hannibal is a cannibal, a cold-blooded, sadistic killer. Throughout the course of the show, Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter fall deeply, madly in love with each other, and Hannibal corrupts Will and makes him, too, a killer. Hannibal is one of my favorite examples of symbolic cannibalism, despite the fact that neither of the main love interests ever cannibalize each other. Cannibalistic themes are utilized in a way throughout the show that it becomes impossible to ignore the metaphorical, the visceral pain of loving another person, the all-consuming desire to become one with another, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to get there. It can also be referred to as an erasure of the self, this complete and utter dedication to becoming one with your lover that you would consume their body in order to do so. Despite the fact that neither of them consume each other, they do engage with the ultimate act of devotion as they both end up willing to and attempting to die for the other person. We expect random acts of violence from men. Men are the people who brought us golden hits of war, genocide, rape, drones, and football. We do not expect murder, pain, and sadism from women, but we are co-opted idiots. Our unshakable belief in women's essential goodness is a wondrous, drooling thing. It's as if none of us ever had mothers who ever acted cruelly, and we all did. Some more than others. A Certain Hunger is one of my all-time favorite books. Published in 2020, Chelsea G. Summers' debut novel is written from the point of view of a convicted serial killer as she sits in prison and narrates her crimes. And fuck, it is finally time to talk about the feminine side of cannibalism. Women have existed under the patriarchy for so long that it becomes impossible to separate the woman from the patriarchal society that she inhabits. Women exist in cages, in confines. Femininity is seen as fragile, as tragic, as soft. As one of my professors so eloquently said to me, women's sadness is palatable for society. The patriarchy has made it an acceptable and even valuable aesthetic. Women's rage, however, is mocked and reviled. Even our extreme emotions are only allowed to exist within confines created by men. A Certain Hunger, for me, exists less of an example of metaphorical cannibalism and more of a radically feminist perspective of feminine obsession and desires and all the other extreme emotions that are typically frowned upon for women to express. The main character doesn't give a shit about whether she is liked or accepted, and she tells the story exactly how it was lived by her. Her cannibalism is less of an act of devotion or affection and more of a nearly erotic desire, which exists in stark contrast to stories such as Bones and All or Yellow Jackets, both of which we will touch on later. Female sexuality is viewed as an enigma in our Western culture, and it is often intertwined with rage in an inseparable way, especially in A Certain Hunger. The narrator describes lust as power, which is a perfect way of describing the imbalance that men and women face, specifically regarding their sexualities. Men, as in all other aspects of life, are the ones holding the power. They get to lust after women, they get to obsess over them and jack off to them and view them as objects of desire. But women? They don't have that same liberty. Women get to be hopeless romantics. They get to have crushes or be in love. They don't get to view men as objects of attraction because the moment a woman hates men outside of sexual gratification, she is a misandrist, a sexist. And that is, when a woman does it, bad. The narrator of A Certain Hunger is unabashed in her near all encompassing desire of men, but not emotionally. And honestly, it's fair in a way. Men in our current society tend to be so far gone, so generally evil and frankly disgusting in many ways that it is entirely understandable to not want to subject oneself to male company. Of course, I am speaking in very broad terms. Not all men are vile, just most. Women that buy into this viewpoint are viewed in such a firmly negative light, seen as psychopaths and whores and just plain terrible people. But shit, just as Chelsea G. Summers expressed in the quote I read out at the beginning of this video, you can only be on a diet for so long before you get very, very hungry. Yellow Jackets. Things I originally wanted to say about Yellow Jackets feel repetitive at this point. The cannibalism in the show is partially born from necessity, but partly ritualistic and partly an act of utter devotion. Unfortunately, I feel no need to do a deep dive into the show and its themes here, but I would highly recommend checking out any other video essay on the subject if you are not yet tired of hearing the phrase cannibalism as a metaphor for love. 2022, specifically, for some reason, was a defining year for the cannibalistic community. The main attraction, of course, was Bones and All, starring Taylor Russell and Timothy Chalamet. It follows a teenage girl named Marin as she grapples with her innate and compulsive need to eat other humans. She leaves home and finds out that this affliction is genetic, that her mother is also one of the eaters, as they're called. On her way to find her mother, she meets an older eater named Sully, who teaches Marin some of the important things about being an eater. However, Marin is put off by Sully's overt and sadistic approach to cannibalism, and she runs away from him while he's occupied. Marin then meets another teenage eater named Lee, and the two of them fall in love as they journey to find Marin's mother. They find her, and Marin gets some semblance of the closure that she needed. Lee and Marin move in together, and they are living their lives together on the down low when Sully comes back for Marin. There's a fight between the three of them, and Lee is badly injured in their pursuit of ending Sully's life. Lee knows he's going to die and insists that Marin eat him. She does so, bones and all. Okay. Bones and All is another example of a female cannibal, though Marin is a much more soft, effeminate, and palatable character than the narrator of A Certain Hunger. However, it works within the context of Marin being a much younger, much less experienced girl who is filled with fear and uncertainty regarding the world and her cannibalistic desires. Bones and All does a beautiful job showing just how susceptible teenage girls are, even the cannibalistic sort. I forgot to say that. The main thing that is interesting and different about it than any other piece of cannibalistic media, however, is the way cannibalism is depicted as an almost affectionate, intimate sacrifice rather than a macabre and revolting crime. It has its flaws, as with anything, though I do think it's a valuable piece of media and a fantastic piece to influence of movement of cannibalistic themes. As a fan of religious themes, metaphors, and connotations, as well as someone who can just appreciate good music, I would rather die than leave out Preacher's Daughter of this essay. Preacher's Daughter is a 2022 album written and performed by Ethel Cain, the main character of the story. The album follows Ethel Cain and her life in small-town Alabama, where she was born into a strict Southern Baptist family, hence the name of the album. She has a few different love interests, but the main one of the story is a man named Isaiah who she meets when he picks her up off the side of the road in Texas. They fall in love, but Isaiah is a gaslighting, manipulative bitch. Ethel is grappling with feeling like she betrayed her family by leaving. She starts hallucinating, and Isaiah becomes distorted. He then kills and cannibalizes her. So, okay, cannibalism here is less metaphorical and more cold-blooded, but Preacher's Daughter lends itself more heavily to female rage in the context of being cannibalized instead of being the cannibalizer. There is so much to be said about this album and its perfection, though very little of it applies to the cannibalism argument and how I'm portraying it in this video. Holy shit, vampires. I'm so sorry, but it would be impossible to thoroughly discuss cannibalism without at least touching on vampires. And no, we're not talking about Twilight. The idea of ingesting another person is obviously quite covert in vampirism, with the drinking of another person's blood. Vampirical themes have been around a lot longer than any of us, with earliest roots tracing back to 1047 Common Era in Russia. The word at the time was upir, meaning the thing at the feast or sacrifice. There are many pieces that combine vampirism and cannibalism, specifically the book Women Eating, which I have yet to read, but I do have it on hold at my library. Unfortunately for you, as the viewer, I would do absolutely anything to bring up the movie Saltburn. Saltburn, Emerald Fennell's 2023 film, is a not-so-secret vampire story. In only one scene are vampires mentioned, a scene where the main character is ingesting the period blood of a woman, but Emerald Fennell does admit that she herself thinks of it as a vampire film. I have many points to make about Saltburn, so many that I could spend hours just speaking on this one film. But for now, I'd like to speak about the queer connotations in relation to ingestion. Oliver, the main character of the movie, makes a bit of a habit of ingesting the bodily fluids of his lovers. This is not incredibly interesting in and of itself, but what is interesting about this is the cultural impact and near widespread hysteria that it caused. Saltburn was regarded as wild and disturbing and disgusting when it first came out, despite how tame period sex is on its own. Again, a conversation for another time. What made the public reaction to the movie so upsetting to me was the fact that the queer connotations seemed to be what made Oliver Quick so unlikable. Sure, he did some bad things, but I do believe that no one would have had such violent reactions to the film if the romance in it had been straight. Oliver is viewed as a monster and other in a way that only queer people are. While Saltburn is not overtly cannibalistic, there was plenty of ingestion as a means to portray obsession, enough for me to include it in this essay about cannibalism as a metaphor. Saltburn is so fucking good, and I have a hard time ever shutting up about it. But for me, Oliver is a symbol of obsession in a way that a lot of the narratives we looked at today are. As said by someone on Tumblr, there is a fine line between love and cannibalism. The perpetual urge to consume the one you love or to offer yourselves up for consumption. Why else is love described as all-consuming? Because that is what it is at its core. Love is consumption. It occurs unconsciously when you're folding in on yourself, rearranging your bones and organs to make yourself small enough to fit inside someone's mouth. Eat me, I'll beg. Devour me whole. Anyways, that's all I have for today, and I suck at writing conclusions. So, yeah. Bye.